All right, so we have here a create user that allows us to append a brand new user to a list. But right now it's always adding the same new user, right? The same username. What we'd like to be able to do instead is have maybe an input field where we can type the actual username, yes, and then when we click on create user, read from that input field, create the object as that for the username for that object, and then add it, right? So let's do that. Let's add an input field. So in the HTML, we can add an input field right here. So this will be input, right? And we can add an ID, and the ID might be username field. Okay. And so in the excuse me, as a variable here, we can bind to a local variable. So we can say let username field with the $sign in front of it, and bind it to the ID username field. There it is, right? Once we have that variable, what we'd like to be able to do is that when the create button is invoked and it's handled by this create user function, instead of using this hard-coded string, right, what we'd like to be able to do is to use the value of whatever that field is. Yes? So we can control the value, we can read from the value by using the .val function, right? So let's do that over here. Instead of username this hard-coded string, we can say const username, right? We can say user field dot val. Value is going to read the current value of our input field. We're going to store it in a local constant, right? And we're going to use that as our value for our username. Yes? All right, so let's take a look at that. If we refresh, and here we type Bob. There it is. So Bob, Ed, Frank, Charlie, right? And we're adding at the bottom. Make sense? As a convenience, we might want to clear the value of the input field every time we click on the button. So here, after reading the value and having it in a local constant, we can clear the value by maybe providing as an argument an empty string, right? And if we do that and we try it here, notice that now it's conveniently emptying the value, right, as we type and click on the button. Yes.
If we had a placeholder, would it show up again?
Yes, of course. Yep. Yeah. So if you have right, so in the you have the input here, and we have the placeholder. We can do that. We can control anything in the DOM, even attributes. We can programmatically change the placeholder. Once we have the field, we can say, hey, username field dot, I want to create a brand new attribute, call placeholder, whose value is username. So that placeholder, right, notice that it was not in the HTML. Typically, you would type the attribute placeholder equal whatever, right? We can change that too. We can manipulate the attributes. We can manipulate the values of the fields, of the attributes and whatnot. We can read the values of those attributes as well. So here, if we type something, create, right, goes the placeholder comes back when it's cleared. Everybody good? Right. One thing to point out here is the differences in syntax of these two value functions. Yes? Notice that the first one doesn't take an argument, val with no argument, and the second one is the same val, but with arguments, right? The first one is behaving as a read operation, whereas the second one is behaving as a write operation. Make sense? Now, in other languages, typically when you have a read and a write that mutators, right? Typically you would have like a set or a get, right? In other, like Java, you would typically have a setter and a getter as a read and a write. Here in JavaScript, the more common thing to do culturally, the more common thing to do is not to use setters and getters, but instead use the same name of the attribute that you're modifying. The name, the value attribute. We're modifying the value attribute, yes? But then use the arguments to determine whether you're doing a write or a read. And so typically would be a read would be the same function with less arguments, like 0. That's a read. And a write would be the same function but with more arguments, right? Which would be a write operation. And this is a common theme throughout the JavaScript language world. Okay, and we'll see lots and lots of examples of this, as we use these types of functions. Everybody good? Right. This doesn't mean that the function has been overloaded. It doesn't mean that there's two versions of the same of this function. Again, there's no overloading in JavaScript. It's just that the function was written, right, to see what arguments you have, and based on those arguments, determine on how to behave and what to do. Okay, just like the jQuery function, you pass it a string. Depending on the string, it knows what to do, right? Okay, excellent.